actually the most famous study that was ever done in the history of psychology, and you have probably heard about it. We're talking about the early 70s here, and there's a researcher named Philip Zimbardo who has come up with the idea of creating a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University. His idea was to collect 24 students and to turn 12 of them into guards and 12 into prisoners. He put them in this fake prison, gave them uniforms, gave them sunglasses, gave them, all the attributes that you need as a standard prison guard. And he wanted to study how these students would behave. Now, it's important to note that many of these students, were just young guys. It was the 60s. Many called themselves hippies or pacifists. These were not violent guys. They were quite friendly people. But as the story goes, they quickly turned into monsters and quickly developed this really horrific, sadistic behavior. After 6 days, the Stanford prison experiment had to be canceled because these students, were basically torturing their other students who were the prisoners in this whole experiment. The Stanford prison experiment became incredibly famous. It ended up in all the textbooks of psychology. It was taught around the globe, but especially in America and the UK, it's been extremely influential. And it is, in my view, another version, or maybe a secular modern version of this veneer theory that we talked about in a previous lecture. The notion that people deep down are just selfish, or animals, or even beasts, that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that if that breaks, if that cracks, we show who we really are. I used to believe this. I wrote about this and I thought, wow, this is a really important study. And I had to change my mind completely. It's only been a couple of years ago now that a French researcher called Thibault Le Texier was the first one who went into the archives, who went to Stanford University and said, well, I want to study what actually really happened behind the scenes, because we have like one paper that describes more or less what happened, but we haven't got the original evidence, the original documentation, right, of what happened. And what he discovered was very, very shocking. What he basically discovered, well, the title of his book, that's only been published in French, sadly, the title of his book says it all, because it's called The History of a Lie. And that's really what it is. The Stanford prison experiment, the most famous experiment in the history of psychology, is a lie. It's a hoax. I'm sorry to have to put it this bluntly, but that's really what it is. We now know, actually, that these students who were supposedly the sadistic monsters were specifically instructed by Philip Zimbardo to behave as nasty and horrific as possible. So, it was so unscientific in almost every single way, but still it became one of the most famous studies in the history of the psychological science. Now, where it gets maybe even more interesting is that not very long ago, actually, well, for a historian, not very long ago, actually already 20 years ago, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, had this idea of repeating the Stanford prison experiment. And they found two psychologists that said, okay, let's do it, let's try it again. But the British psychologists said, okay, we only want to do it on the condition that we do not interfere. So we're going to create this fake prison, divide the group up into prisoners, into guards, and study their behavior, but we're not going to interfere. We're not going to instruct them how to behave. And you know what happened? They created the most boring 6 hours of television that has ever been created in the history of television. pretty much nothing happened in that whole experiment. Actually told us another dark truth about human nature is that people just want to, well, they basically build a pacifistic commune if you leave them alone. Again, very, very much the opposite of what the standard story always told us. Now, the question is obviously, why has the Stanford Prison Experiment and also the bystander effect, that theory, why have they been so influential, right? Why have these theories been in the textbook for decades? What's behind that? And in my view, what's behind it is this much older idea that's so deeply embedded in our culture, which says that humans, deep down, are just selfish, and that's what it is. Luckily, that has massively and radically changed. And if you now start studying psychology as a young student, they'll teach you very, very different things. There's much more emphasis right now on our ability to cooperate, our ability to work together. Now, that doesn't mean that we're angels or anything. We're clearly not. But the new science of psychology is much more about the bright side of human nature. And I think that is a very good thing and a very welcome change.